Excellent. Welcome. Thank you all. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Today is day 3 of National Black Researchers Week. And tonight's session, which I'm extremely happy, excited about, talking about trauma-informed research. My name is Araba Asan. I will be moderating this panel for tonight's session. And I just want to introduce you all to these 2 lovely panelists who have volunteered their time to speak with us tonight. So I will pass it over to our great panelists.
Hello, everyone. Wherever you are in the world, I am Dr. Lisa Collins. I am an associate professor at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. And my scholarship is in racial trauma, racial healing.
Hello, and I'm Dr. Brooksy Sturdivant. I'm from North Carolina. I'm a public school educator and I'm a career educator. So that's been my career for the entire duration. 22 years to be exact, and I'm off for summer break after 7 years of not having a summer break. So I'm excited about that. I research trauma and students' responses and how that shows up in educational settings. So I'm excited to be here tonight to share with you my experience as a researcher. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both. Oh, yes, I'm glad, Dr. Sturdivant, that, you finally have a summer break so you can actually enjoy, get some nice sun, soak in the sand, maybe get a drink or two, just to really, enjoy your summer. So that's excellent. So just want to get into, just our first round of questions. How would you both describe trauma-informed research?
Guess I'll take this one first. I would say trauma-informed research, thinking from an educational standpoint, I became curious because I wanted to look at just some of the causes and specifically the responses and how students were showing up after experiencing trauma. I definitely got curious about the effects, whether they were short-term or long-term, and how that showed up, like I said, in educational settings. I definitely, as an educator, would want to know solutions, interventions, things we can do in those spaces to mitigate some of those effects. So those are just a few things that come to mind for me.
And for me, when I think about trauma-informed research, if I put the lens that I studied and have lived through, the racialized trauma is on a pinnacle, and then other traumas are underneath them. So trauma-informed would be a humanistic approach to looking at people and how they interact with various systems, various oppressive practices. And so trauma-informed would be caring for the whole person where they are in space instead of superimposing something on top of them. So I've been in a training before where they had lots of snacks and a blanket. Like, do you need a blanket? I mean, and it wasn't my mom. So being able to have a humanistic approach toward people, to me, really is the foundation of trauma-informed. And research being, as was mentioned before, when we look at educational practices, mental health, any kind of system and structure, are those structures providing the same care and humanistic approach? And I think that's where trauma-informed comes in.
And I'll add a few other concepts that surfaced during my research. I definitely spent some time looking at coping and how students do cope in the midst of trauma. And then resilience and resistance even surfaced because oftentimes, like you're mentioning with these systems, is it a person being resilient to these experiences, or are they actually resisting? So looking at how they're navigating their resources, negotiating for those resources, is that a form of resistance or resilience? So that was another area that I chose to dig a little deep in.
Excellent. Thank you both. And it sounds like, what I'm hearing is that, in terms of trauma-informed research, there's a lot of looking at the whole person and really, especially looking at the racialized trauma and, just given everything that happened in the news recently and continue to going on, we can definitely, I really would like to dive deep into that because I think that is, I believe, at the crux of, just dealing with just trauma, mental health, mental wellness, well-being. And as a Black researcher in this field, how would you describe your journey? How does someone who is interested in trauma-informed research, how do they, what are like the stepping stones for them to enter into the field?
I guess we're going to take turns, so I'll go first this time. For me, I was the subject of my research. Racial healing was my doctoral work, and it was an autoethnography. I studied my lived experience in Oregon in 3 school districts. And what I found is that I experienced racial trauma 5 times more than racial healing. I experienced oppressive practices, white supremacy, and organizational trauma. So for me, the entry point was looking at students inside of public school systems and seeing them marginalized and othered, and me being curious that ESSA had in it a clause or a phrase, or I don't know what they call it, but it said teachers will be trauma informed. And I thought, well, how is that going to happen? And then I saw this big movement in my state where they were training people talking about trauma, but I still got that feeling in my gut, it was othered. They have trauma, like there's something wrong with them. So therefore, of course, there's that hierarchy of I'm going to help them so I was like, they don't understand. And that is for me, the on-ramp. Plus I have children. I have a 11-year-old is my youngest, but I started thinking, how am I going to interrupt the systems and the cycles that happen to him and try to protect him from some of the things that he is experiencing? For me, I was coming from it from an educator point of view, from a Black woman point of view, and from a mother point of view.
So similar to what you're saying, my exploration of it definitely was personal. Basically, I experienced trauma at a young age in the form of maternal neglect. So the adverse childhood experiences study definitely was really relevant in my research. Because when I look at those ACEs, I'm sure a lot of you've heard of that. I experienced the 4. So, the research says if you've experienced 4 or more, especially over a long period of time, then you could have these adverse effects. So based on that lived experience and seeing how some of it did play out even into adulthood, that made me curious, because when I looked at the literature, I found these checklists. Oh, if students have these things in place, they'll be resilient. And I just kind of laughed, like, thanks for the checklist, but do you know what it looks like to try to navigate for those resources in real time, especially as a child? Because I would say I recognized my adverse situation as early as age 6. By age 8, I flat out said, nobody's in charge of me. So with that came the fear, the shame of my household situation. And then later that surfaced as even anger. So all of those emotional responses that I dealt with and luckily was able to navigate and overcome. That's why I became interested in like academic resilience and showcasing, look, you can give us this checklist of resources. You can say that this is what resilience looks like. Thank you. And yes, educators do need to know that, but where are the voices in the literature that actually shows this is how this plays out in everyday life for these people living in these situations? It's not as simple as it appears in writing. So my study became twofold, and I did autoethnography as well. So that's pretty significant or a great similarity. But I wanted to show, listen, it's very challenging. Yes, we can do it. Yes, we will do it. But you need to know that it's tough, especially if the resources aren't more readily available. And then I also wanted to show, okay, what does this academic resilience look like? So it was a twofold study because I was able to show, look, we did navigate it, because I ended up doing autoethnography to showcase my own attempts to navigate, as well as 2 other participants in the study. So it became like narrative inquiry as well. And so that's what I saw was missing, those stories. Like, we need to show this is what this really looks like. And by telling those stories, we're helping to build the toolkit of, okay, if we had these things in place for students who are exposed to these things, then it could be more helpful, rather than expecting them to navigate it on their own, because that's what I found myself doing quite frequently. Thanks.
That is such a great point, because I too took the ACEs, and when I had never heard of ACEs, and I was like, wait, I failed the ACEs. But according to the test, I wasn't supposed to make it as far as I made it. So I was like, but I did. Mm-hmm. So if you had given that to me when I was a little, and then turned around and told me, well, you know what, Lisa, you're not going to make it. You're not going to get up there because you have all these other issues, then you're putting a ceiling on my head. So I love what you said about, like, not only yourself, but other people, like, there's a great talk by Jeff Andrade, and he talks about, in the improvement science talk, like, you talk about kids need grit. They got grit. They got everything they need. They got grit. They know how getting to school is gritty. So it's like, in taking away the invisibilization of our agency and all of the gifts that we bring that are not centered in dominant and seemingly dominant culture. Right? So that I love that bringing of what is, or what you know that is.
I was thinking a little bit more about the initial question about just the different types of backgrounds, people who want to explore the trauma-informed studies. And it was tough for me as an educator, because it's almost like I knew what I knew from my lived experience.
Yeah.
Then to step over into the research realm, especially not having the psychology or the counseling background, it's like, okay, I'm supposed to use this language. I'm supposed to make sure that I'm showcasing and doing it justice. So I say that to say we have to persevere. Like, traditionally, it should have probably been a psychologist or a counselor doing the study that I did. But it's like, no, I'm an educator. I live this, and I can join this conversation. So that was like one barrier I had to get over for myself, like talking myself out of it. Like, who are you to now step into this field, so to speak, and start talking about this topic that's not traditionally something that an educator would study? But I'm like, why not me? Like, my insight, my ability to interpret what those ladies in my study shared, like, I had to kind of talk myself back into it. So there was a lot of back and forth. And I say that for future researchers, like, our voice is definitely needed. So to me, it doesn't matter what field. If you have the stories, the experience, and the passion to investigate this particular topic, I say go for it. Yeah, it came with a few challenges, because like I said, I had to delve into new vocabulary, and am I defining this right, or am I labeling this particular thing properly? But it was definitely worth persevering in that instant.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Also, I mean, in my work as well as an educator, crossed over into sociology, interpersonal neurobiology, organizational learning, organizational theory, Afrocentric paradigm. So I think, like, if you're thinking about, like, hey, I want to dive in, you want to make sure whoever's on your committee are people who can support that work. And I had wonderful people on my committee that supported me. I'm just blending. So my work is a blend of all of these different research.
Oh, wow. Like, my goodness, just dropping gems, gems, gems. Thank you both for sharing your story. It's really inspiring. And I also just kind of want to go back to a little bit what the two of you mentioned about ACEs. For those who don't necessarily, or those who have heard the term but don't necessarily know what it is and how that can really creep up in your everyday life and how that can really affect your mental, your physical, your spiritual well-being. I was wondering if you, Dr. Collins, or you, Dr. Sternevent, can really explain in your own words what ACEs is and how that can show up in various different aspects of your life.
Well, basically, there was a study, and they basically had these patients showing up with all of these medical conditions. So you're talking about a clinic, urban area. Patients were showing up with all of these ailments, and the doctors saw this pattern of like, well, wait a minute, these ailments should be a person that's much older, but the patients were like in their 30s, 40s, but their bodies were worn out. So the doctors became curious and started to inquire, like, well, what have been some of your experience? Like, how can your body be surfacing all of these ailments? So in investigating that, they determined that there were 10 household um, adverse circumstances, basically, that these people had encountered. And based on those patterns, they were able to narrow it down to the top 10. So they fall under neglect, abuse, and then just household dysfunction. So those three categories, and then they have 10 subsets under those three. And so there's like a little inventory. You can ask yourself about those 10. And then again, if you've experienced 4 or more out of those 10, then you're more susceptible to then have these health and behavioral outcomes. So as an educator, like I said, you get curious, like, well, how can we mitigate that? There's no reason why people should get into their 20s, 30s, 40s, still grappling with their experiences from childhood. So once that study came out, we as educators got curious, like, oh, we need to mitigate some of this. And that's pretty much what it boils down to.
I have nothing more to add. She nailed it.
Great, excellent. Thank you both. That actually leads me to my next question. Since you both talked about the kind of internalized trauma and psyche that you both had to go through when you went into this research, and I'm thinking about, really just within the past maybe month and a half, talking about racialized trauma. I'm thinking about those souls that were taken by a white domestic terrorist in Buffalo, New York. I'm also thinking about the shooting that happened in Uvalde, Texas, dealing with Latinx children and their caretakers, their teachers, and how those two communities have a common link, which is just racialized violence, racialized trauma, hatred. And I was just wondering, not just as educators and researchers, but as Black women working in this space, how do you both truly maintain your mental health, your spiritual health, and your physical health, knowing that we are dealing with just essentially certain parts of the country who feel the need to hate as a driving force to exert power, to exert dominance? So how do you all really, take care or maintain your mental health, just working in this field and just overall generally?
Well, that's not an easy question, is it? You go first.
Well, a few things come to mind, and I'll I guess I'll start with the heavy one, then I'll give you the lighter answer. Um, Believe it or not, I dive in all the more. Like I'm okay with facilitating courageous conversations. I'm fine with asking the tough questions. I don't mind pulling out the research, the charts. I'll show the disaggregated data to highlight the outcomes, to draw attention to the area of need. So being in education, I like to say I'm a watch woman on the wall instead of a watchman on the wall, but watch women on the wall. Um, and I feel like it's an obligation and a responsibility to speak up for students who've been silenced. So I've done that my entire career, whether that's working directly with those students through mentoring, whether that's facilitating conversations with colleagues, whether that's bringing things to the attention of even superiors to question just some practices or some direction. So it's been tough. That sometimes adds to the stress, but I think it's necessary and it's gratifying. So that's a personal way that I get gratification, because it is tough. You're exposing yourself to these things, you learn and you know, but somehow I get joy from speaking up, especially if it affects change. I would definitely be more stressed if I was silent. I would probably just explode. So getting it out, sharing it, and highlighting areas of need is one way that I actually kind of balance it out, because I feel like at least I'm making somewhat of a difference rather than just allowing things to persist. On the lighter side, I like to travel. I like to eat in moderation. I like good food. So
Oh,
not that I
yes.
just go all
Nothing but
in, but I
good
like
food.
really good food. So that's one way I kind of celebrate and reward myself. Travel. I love like historical travel. So that's kind of gratifying. And I feel like I'm able to pour back into myself and just see wonderful things throughout the world. Because sometimes you can feel like you're smothering, is what I call it.
Yes.
But by escaping and going to see these things that you maybe only see in the pictures, it's like, wow, things are bigger than this little bubble people try to keep you in. So that I love travel. And that's where I get a lot of the good food. Swimming is my other thing. Because to me, that's the exercise from all the eating. And it's so relaxing. It's like when I float, I'm just on top of it all. Like it's not smothering me. I'm not drowning. I'm actually on top of it. So it's just kind of like those symbolic ways. I love to write. So the journaling, the poetry, and getting it out that way. I've done that throughout my career. And then talking to friends and getting massages. I had a whole list.
Oh,
Just do
yeah.
you. That's what I do. Do you.
Oh, yeah. Massages are great, going to spas. And Dr. Cernavan, you mentioned that you traveled. What places have you traveled, or what it in the country, outside the country?
I go outside of the country. I mean, I've
Oh,
definitely traveled within the country. Like I love going to California. I love Florida because I like beaches. I definitely like beaches. But I've gone to a lot of the islands. I've gone to Hawaii. I've gone to Europe a few times because the history and the food is what I like about Europe. Like to go to Italy and have real Italian food,
oh, yes.
amazing. It's like pizza's not pizza here. It's like, what is that?
Oh,
Real
yes.
pizza. Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
So,
absolutely.
and I'm getting too old for pizza, but yeah, the pizza in Italy is a
Oh,
must.
excellent. Now I gotta, start booking my flight trips, because now I'm a little jealous. But don't worry, I will definitely find my way to traveling. Thank you so
Well, I
much.
got some good travel tips, so
Oh,
reach out.
yes. Can't wait. Can't wait. Thank you so much. Dr. Collins?
Well, that was quite a loaded question. It had so much in it. I guess I'll peel back a little bit and I'll just tease it back. So the world, I think that I'm a person who I'm in the world, but I'm not of the world. And there's many, many things that are going on that are really harsh. And it can be disheartening. Like you can just, the loss of life, the torture, it can be a bit much. So for me, my grounding is in a spiritual connection. It's in meditation, and it's in connecting to what I call spirit, but many people call many things: Mother Nature, the universe, the earth, so many different things. But that connection is the connection that kept my people, that survived through the Middle Passage, the ones that went through slavery, the ones that lost their children, all of the harm that Black people experience that lives in my system. So what I do is I try to heal the past and the present. I try to have the healing go to the back of me, all the way down the generations, and then to go forward and ground myself in not ignoring, because what happened in my work is that I was able to look and see the spiral of what has come from the past. And when it comes forward, it just turns into, I call it the swirl. So I'm swirling with what my past historical and generational trauma, along with what's happening in the world today. I'm only better when I'm centered and when I'm connected to the light. I can't do any good any other way. So I use that as my push forward, and I ground myself to say, what do you need to do today, Lisa? Who do you need to help today? And that helps me put a foundation under me. I loved everything that was mentioned before: massages, exercise, connecting with my people. And not only do I have to remember who I am and whose I am, and ground myself in my ancestral knowledge. That makes me so much better. It makes me like I can breathe. And so something like this, seeing your beautiful faces here and knowing the people who are I can't see you, but I know you're there. This is what helps me to ground. Is another thing: community. Having community, being connected spiritually, and taking care of my spiritual, mental, and physical self, so that I could do what I was supposed to do on this earth. And so sometimes that's like not watching the news. That's sometimes praying for those souls who have passed on, have crossed over. It's doing opposite of what my ego wants to do. And it helps me to be able to continue on.
Wonderful. Thank you both. That was such, powerful testimony. And Dr. Collins, I loved what you said about really being centered and grounded in you, focusing on you. Also, you and Dr. Sturdivant, you both mentioned, really being centered and grounded in yourself and your well-being and where you come from. And that, also leads me to a follow-up question, just given what the two of you said previously, how do you both overcome the challenges of reliving past traumas or racialized traumas for the sake of, your research or any research that you're doing?
It was definitely tough for me. My research aligns with my dissertation work. So doing that study, completing that project, revisiting all of those feelings, emotions, even in interviewing the young ladies that were the participants and hearing their stories, and just almost this, everything you thought is true. Like, that was a part of it. I'm going to include the other participants who were much younger than I am, had experienced it more recently than I had, but to hear their stories, to see some of the similarities in the way they were responding, and to see these patterns that wasn't necessarily showing up in the literature specifically related to Black women, it was very powerful. Like, okay, everything you've been thinking is really the truth. And now you're going to be able to put that in writing for other people to see that, okay, these are our stories. These are our experiences. This is how this looks for us. It definitely surfaced a lot of feelings, emotions, and just, like I said before, some gratification. So it goes back to what I was saying, just that obligation, almost like you said, like, let your light shine. This has been your experience. It's your responsibility to share that. The fact that you even endured and survived is important. You have this insight. You definitely need to get it in writing. Um, I would say that that was key. So it was difficult, but definitely rewarding, and necessary.
And I would say that everything I've learned, they used to say when I was growing up, a hard head make a soft behind. So everything I've learned has been because I have a hard head. And as I was doing my research, I was studying trauma policy. I wasn't studying myself. And I heard this voice say, "You're the subject." And I said, "Me? I'm the subject." And I pivoted. That was a pivot where I started to look at my own experience. And it was not pretty. It was actually pretty ugly. And what happened in my work is by me examining my own lived experience, racial healing occurred. And the healing occurred by me looking at my experience and looking for a way for my own redemption. And a framework was created for racial healing came out. I would have never imagined that. I couldn't believe it. Actually, I think I'm being guided. And I just looked up and went, "What? I can't believe this happened." So actually, what I call in my work, racial regulation. Racial regulation is like you're regulated. So I can I cannot say your last name, doctor, but I'm going to say, like my sister just said, she talked about leaning in and doing the work. To be able to do that, you have to have some regulation. And how I have racial regulation is that I have gone back and healed the other traumas. So whatever trauma I had that I grew up with, I worked on those before I worked on my racial trauma. And in my work, that racial regulation is part of it. So can I lean in? I know how to, what they say, I know when to roll them, I know when to hold them, I know when to walk away, I know when to run. I'm going to lean in and I trust my body because now I'm centered in my body because part of the work is body work, right? And so I know like, I don't want to have this conversation today, or I don't think so. And I know that, but before I didn't. So I would run in like Braveheart every time to save. But who was I saving? I was saving myself. I was saving myself. And so it's important that we talk about this at every level so that we can heal, and then we all can stand up in community and lean in, just like was mentioned earlier. Having a courageous conversation, doing it, but you have to have your own regulation or else it's a moot point, right? You just go back into the cycles.
I love that, having your own racial regulation. And Dr. Collins, just, following up on what you mentioned about your own racial healing, and Dr. Sturdivant, you can also jump in as well. Do you feel like you have fully healed from your racial trauma, or is that an ongoing issue?
Well, I wish I could say I am healed from head to toe. But every day I walk out into a very dominant space, and no one has to say anything to me for me to get the neurotoxins of hatred. All I have to do is walk down the street. So for me, I've learned to do some things to take care of myself, and I know exactly when to pull back. But before, every one of those, every one of the incidents is 1,000 paper cuts, right? It would have been 1,000 paper cuts on top of 1,000 paper cuts. Now it may be 1 or 2 paper cuts. I know how to move out of the way, but it's not 1,000 on top of 1,000. That's the racial regulation part.
Excellent. Dr. Sturdivant, do you have anything else that you would like to add?
Not specifically. I mean, I agree. I think that healing is ongoing. Like you never know what might serve as a trigger,
Yeah.
especially being female with hormones. But for the
Yep.
most part, you just persevere and pick yourself up if you have a down day. But I do think that, I mean, there's definitely work to be done so that you can heal. And I'll say, like you, before I jumped into the research, I definitely worked through a lot of my challenges. So I would say it's still ongoing. I don't think anybody's ever arrived and perfected it, but there's a process you can go through before you dive in so that you're not triggered so readily.
Mhm.
And I think what I'd like to see is and this comes from the work that I've done, is I would love to see communities of support, healing communities of support like this, for us, by us. And I'd like to see the same kind of communities of support for non-people of color, because they don't have a place to talk about race either. They don't have a place for their own growing and learning. And it's our collective well-being that's important here. Yes, everyone needs to do their own work, but collectively we can change things. And so I would love to see communities where people, I don't know, they call it meetups or whatever, but I would love to see racially healing community spaces where we can go and talk about these things and grow and learn together.
And that's one thing we've definitely been trying to do more of in school, through restorative practices and offering circle time and helping students process past, present, future so that they can move forward a little bit more quickly rather than, like I said before, just grappling and staying stagnant and I guess spiraling in their own thoughts about a matter. We also try to see students' responses, and then you can help them rewrite those scripts. So when this happens and you experience this trigger, maybe this is how you usually respond, but getting students to realize, okay, there's a spectrum, like you don't have to go from 0 to 100 in your response. Let's process some of those feelings, how it's making you feel, where did you get that particular behavior from, and then let's rethink some other options as to how you can respond when you experience that feeling. So those are some of the things that we do to, I guess, try to shift that, because you don't want people to just grapple in that space of trauma and
Right.
only respond the one way that they maybe know. You can help to, like I said, mitigate some of that. And so that's some of the work that we've been doing in school settings.
Can I ask a question? Does that same work happen in home settings?
So I agree with you. I think we need more spaces for that to happen in the community so that we can build those skills. So specifically with the restorative practices, because I'm a trainer for that. There are organizations now that do it community-based. So a lot of nonprofits are popping up that are now saying, oh, we'll do community-based restorative practices. So it's happening in pockets. I think that all of this language is somewhat new, especially when it comes to this. These are things we can do for students. We've always known there's been adversity. We know that there's trauma that students experience things. It's now the what do we do to mitigate it? I think that's more of a new conversation, especially thinking about all of the push for academics and curriculum development and what strategies should you use instructionally. That's mainly been the conversation K-12. Now it's like, no, we need social emotional learning. We need to focus on the whole child. And again, I've been doing this 22 years. So that was kind of the conversation when I first started teaching. Then it went away.
Right.
We had this push for curriculum. And now it's like, okay, wait a minute. You're dropping the ball because students are facing some challenges. So it's starting to become the norm and more conversations about it. I think it's just the implementation and the time to get it done.
Right.
But as far as in homes, I think the nonprofits that are now doing it in the community, it can definitely trickle into the homes.
Mm-hmm. I have this longing, this, like, I don't know if it's like my old soul or what, this longing for us to take our children back and for us to have the grounding be at home, to have the education be at home. And I've been talking like this since I was a new teacher, but there's something in me that just keeps pulling me to, community and having something for having what's ours that was taken away by Brown.
Right. And in my study, that's some of what surfaced, because even in talking to the younger ladies, like, it was so gratifying because they did talk about some of the community resources, which was sort of shocking for me because I grew up in a rural area where you still rode on a church van, and the church van would come pick you up even if your mother was incapacitated and couldn't take you to church. So it was small things like that that I knew were my resources that made a huge difference. The other mothers in the community who allowed me to eat dinner with their daughters, kind of secretively knowing, okay, her mom's not cooking. Oh, we've got extra food, you want to eat with us? So it's like the
Mhm.
subtle way that they would do it, not make me feel
Mhm.
uncomfortable or needy, but okay, feeling welcomed. And then those examples. Um, so hearing the stories and getting that insight from the girls, seeing that they were navigating these community-based resources, I'm like you, as an educator, I'm torn. It's like, do we fix this system,
Mhm.
school system, which I think that's necessary. Like, it definitely needs to be fixed. But then in the meantime, there's so much more we could be doing in the community because, like I said, community was key for me. Community was key for the girls in my study. Um, I do think we need more in the community. I'm in the process of starting a nonprofit for that very reason, because it's kind of like, yes, I want to do it through the school system, and yes, I'll continue to do it through the school system, but we also need it over here. So my whole career, I've done mentoring, after school programs. Let's start a club, a girl support group, because it's just not enough to think it's going to happen in the classroom. And at some point, we drop the ball as a community, thinking that that was sufficient.
Mm-hmm. I think what happened to me in my work is that I stopped buying the idea that I was going to fit. I just
Mhm.
accepted that it wasn't built for me, and that's okay. But long as I know what I'm on the other end of I'm on the other end of the spectrum, and I can look for ways to strategically do the work. So I applaud the work that you have done inside of school systems, knowing that's a heavy lift. And my experience is, as soon as you get it rolling real good, then there's a monkey wrench that comes in, and then you're like, okay. But I think the system is meant to do what it's doing, and so I'm looking forward to your nonprofit. It's to see what stars are going to align here, because I think that the Eurocentric paradigm is not the Afrocentric paradigm. And once I realized that there was an Afrocentric paradigm, I was like, oh, I fit over here. But the whole time I kept thinking my colleagues and in the places I worked, that we were on the same page, and we weren't on the same page.
Yeah.
Yes, it's tough because I think about the resources, infrastructure, facilities, that all of us pay taxes. Those funds, those structures are ours. So that's what's tough for me, to have to do the grassroots approach, start from scratch. I don't have a building. So I mean, sometimes that's where I get torn. It's like, no, the system should do what it's supposed to do.
Right.
And I'm okay with saying that in the forms where I say it, but yeah, it's a heavy lift. It's tough, and I'm definitely with you. In the meantime, we still better do some things through the community.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love what you both said about, just really investing in our own institutions. It's important and it's essential, and it is needed for us to really grow as individuals. I just want to get to a few questions in the chat box. I see that they are rolling. This has been a wonderful conversation. This question is directed to both panelists. What are some indicators community members can use to assess if an organization is delivering health services to them that is specific in trauma-informed care?
You might have to repeat it for me. I'm very visual, so I would do better
Sure.
if I could see the question. So I do apologize.
Yeah, sure. No questions. So, one attendee asked, what are some indicators that community members, residents can use if they want to assess an organization that is coming in, delivering health services to them that is specific towards trauma informed care?
I have an experience that I think I could share here because I went to the doctor not that long ago and I never had an experience like this. First of all, they told me everything that they were going to do. They informed me and then they asked me. I mean, like everything, I'm going to walk into the room. Are you okay with that? Like every single solitary thing. They gave me a form to fill out before I checked in. And then when I got there, they gave me the same kind of like, do you have food? Are you like kind of like safety questions? And they asked me that when I checked in online, and then they gave me a form when I got there, the same kind of questions. Do I have need? And then when I got in the back room, they asked me again. And I thought, what is going on with the doctor? Like, I have never had this. And anytime they touched me, they told me what they were going to do before they did it. And then they asked me if I was okay if they did it. I never had, to me, I was like, I don't know, they had training or what, but it was super trauma informed. I was asked lots of questions and I was given lots of choices.
Yes, there are like guiding principles for trauma informed approaches. So you mentioned safety, and then you have the relationships category as well as self-regulation. So I feel like there are like 6 guiding principles that could easily be translated into like a rubric or just kind of a checklist. Are they offering me these things? Then that, like you said, aligns with trauma informed practices. So I can put a link that kind of lists those if you all are interested in that. Because
Yeah,
again, like I said, this could become like a little checklist or it's just something for you to kind of gauge, are they offering me these things? Then that um, would show that they're being trauma informed.
excellent. Thank you both. This next question deals with funding opportunities. So, this particular attendee is interested in economic trauma and how it affects childhood, as well as, let's say, an abort slash adopt instead of parent. And they were wondering how is someone to find funding to do research in this area?
Um, so funding is definitely tricky. I always look at it like who's backing that cause because it may have to be a business that cares about that particular cause or an existing foundation that cares about that cause. So even in my own searches, I've tried to be creative in how I think about it. Like, could it be some funding that's set aside for juvenile justice, depending on your area of interest? Could it be funding that's set aside for specific mentoring or intervention type programs? So rather than, I guess, searching trauma funding, you got to almost think about what are you trying to mitigate or what are you trying to offer slash support. You can think about drug and alcohol administration. Like, is there some funding that's specific to interventions that would help mitigate that? Because that's a direct correlation to adverse childhood experiences. Um, Another one that comes to mind is like financial literacy. I know you mentioned economics in that particular question. So there's a huge push for more financial literacy. So there may be funding that would support people in those efforts. So I don't have a link for this one, but that's kind of how I've been framing it. Like, I need funding to help mitigate blank. So then that's where the funding may be more specific than I just want to disrupt trauma, if that makes sense.
And that makes sense to me too. And sometimes there's calls for this one little specific thing. Like we want to look at students whose parents are incarcerated or behind bars or adults in custody. And then, you know, it's about making the work meaningful for you, in my opinion. The trails go, to me, I go back to this kind of a systemic oppression. Like the trails go where someone has decided that they're going to go, but what is it that you really want to do? And is there a trail that fits? I have a trauma-informed document. I can't drop it in the chat, but I will email it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I see we are almost out of time, so I will ask one last question from the audience. And this one is specific to Dr. Collins. What recommendations would you give researchers interested in using autoethnography or ethnography as a critical research method?
Oh, well, I think one of the things that I'll share my experience that worked well for me is I had two people on my committee who used autoethnography or ethnography. So two scholars who used it. And so that, two Black scholars. So that for me was a great support. Also, I saw, like, I think my autoethnography was the first one from my institution. So also there was a little bit of a kind of a snub, like, what's autoethnography? So I also kind of check your institution and check out like what the vibe is there, I think is important. And then look at autoethnographies or look at ethnographies. You know, the thing is this for me, like I studied myself and you're getting vulnerable. You're kind of stripping down to the T's, and that is your work. And that's what you're sharing about. So if you don't want to strip down to the T's, I would suggest don't do that. But I found out stuff about myself that I didn't know, and it is written inside my work. So there is a vulnerability to it that I think is important to note.
And I'll just add, it's a huge piece of it is the analysis of your story. Because sometimes you can kind of get stuck on, okay, I want to tell the story, but it's stepping outside and viewing your story and then analyzing that through the literature. So what conceptual framework are you using? What theoretical framework are you using? And then how is your story highlighting those particular instances? So you're almost showcasing your story, and you're the researcher talking about your story as if it's not yours. So the analysis was really huge, and that was what was so powerful in even presenting the story.
Excellent. Thank you both. So this next question will actually be our actual last question. And I just want to thank you both. This has been a very rich conversation. I feel like so many gems were dropped here and so many resources. For those who want to keep up with your work, all the things that you do, how can they connect with you?
I think in the chat, it says like you can hit us up on LinkedIn, and it looks like there's something in the chat if you want to. I haven't clicked on it yet, but I'm sure it's a link that takes you to us.
I'll add a link to my website in the chat as well.
Excellent. Thank you both. Yes, you can all connect with Dr. Collins and Dr. Sturdivant on LinkedIn, and also via email as well if they're comfortable. And I just want to thank you both. This has been wonderful. And I just really look forward to what you both have next.